The first thing they asked me was how many campaigns I had won before the human war. I told them 42. The second thing they asked was how the Vorn Ascendancy, the greatest military force this galaxy had produced in 4 centuries, lost a war to a species that barely understood faster than light travel when we first detected them. I told the tribunal to be patient. I told them it was going to take a while. And I told them that by the time I finished, not a single one of them would ever again use the word primitive to describe a human being. I am Vareth of the 8th Division, former commander of the Vorn ground forces on the third world of Sol. I am what remains of a soldier who believed, with every cell in his body, that the coming campaign would be the easiest of his life. I was wrong in ways that still wake me at night. Let me start before the war, because the arrogance matters. You need to understand how certain we were, or you will not understand how completely we were undone. My career began when I was young and hard and burning with ambition. The Ascendancy had given us a galaxy to shape, and we shaped it with discipline and precision. We had broken the Shorn Collective in 19 days. We had pacified the Drek hegemony in a single season. Both of those species had organized militaries, standing fleets, and centuries of warfare. We had taken them apart like old machines. 6 species fell before I turned 40 cycles. 6 species looked at what we were, what we carried, what we were capable of, and they chose to stop fighting. Some of them chose wisely and were allowed to rebuild under Vorn governance. Some chose too late and had very little left to rebuild with. I never lost sleep over any of it. War to me was a problem in mathematics. You counted your strength, you counted theirs, you subtracted. If the number favored you, you advanced. If the number did not, you waited until it did. I had never waited long. So when High Command called me into the briefing room and told me about the third planet of the Sol system, I sat down in my chair with the same calm I always brought. I had my data pad, I had my reports, I had my record. The analysts walked us through everything. The humans were bipedal, 2 arms, 2 legs, 1 head, a completely unarmored body, no carapace, no natural shielding, no redundant organ systems. Their skin was soft enough to tear on a rough surface. Their bones, while reasonably dense for their size, would not survive the kind of kinetic trauma that my soldiers absorbed routinely. They bled easily. They healed slowly. They lived for roughly a century if nothing killed them first, which meant that their oldest soldiers had perhaps 60 years of useful physical life before their bodies began to fail. They had no natural weapons to speak of, no venom, no claws that could pierce our armor, no biological defenses that gave them any advantage over our own infantry. What they had instead was technology, and even that technology, our analysts were quick to point out, was behind ours by roughly 300 years. Their fastest ship in the sector could not outrun our slowest freighter. Their weapons, which they called railguns and plasma cannons, were effective but not surprising. We had seen better from species we had already absorbed. The mood in that briefing room was relaxed. Several of my colleagues were already making jokes. One general estimated the campaign would be finished before his next leave cycle. Someone else made a comment about the efficiency of our supply chain, that we might not even need to restock once. I smiled at the jokes. I did not make any of my own. There was something in the data that kept pulling my attention back. Not anything alarming. Not anything my training flagged as dangerous. It was a small thing. Almost nothing. Decades before our arrival in their system, the humans had launched a probe. Not a military probe. Not a surveillance instrument. Something they called the Voyager series. These small, slow machines had traveled out of the Sol system carrying something remarkable. Music, mathematical sequences, images of their world, the coordinates of their sun. It was an invitation. An intelligent species, barely advanced enough to leave their own gravity well, had looked up at the stars and, rather than arming itself, had built a small machine to carry a greeting to whatever might be listening. I remember staring at that detail in the briefing file, while everyone around me laughed about supply chains. I remember thinking, what kind of creature looks at the unknown and sends it a gift? I closed the file. I told myself it was irrelevant, a symbolic gesture from a young civilization. Probably not even representative of how they thought now, after so many more years of development. I told myself a lot of things in that briefing room. Commander Vrail, who led our overall campaign strategy, gave the final summary. He laid out the conquest in 4 phases. Phase 1 was orbital supremacy, which we expected to achieve in under 3 days given the capability gap between our fleets. Phase 2 was the neutralization of command infrastructure on the target colony world, designated Keth by the colonists who had settled it. Phase 3 was ground pacification, which my division would handle. Phase 4 was the standard transition to governance. Vrail finished his summary and looked around the table. He asked if anyone had concerns. I thought about the probe. I thought about the music it carried, the strange and earnest hope wrapped up in a machine the size of a ground vehicle, drifting through the dark between stars. I said nothing. That silence is the first thing I would change if I could go back. We left for the Sol system with 300 warships, 40,000 ground troops, and enough confidence to fill a planet. I was in my command vessel, reviewing data on human military doctrine, when one of my junior analysts, a young officer I will call Venkasa, brought me an additional file. It was a translation of human military history. I read it the way I read all intelligence, looking for patterns, weaknesses, the shape of how they thought about conflict. What I found was not comforting, but I was good at telling myself things were fine. The humans had been at war with each other for most of their recorded history. Not small skirmishes, not border disputes, full, catastrophic, species-threatening wars that left millions of their own kind gone. And yet there they were, still present, still expanding, still building probes to carry greetings to strangers. They did not stop wars, they survived them. They survived them and then went back to building things. I set the file aside. We were a day from arrival. There was no room in my mind for second thoughts. What I should have felt reading those files was fear. What I felt instead was impatience. I wanted to begin. I wanted to finish. I wanted to return home with my 43rd victory and add another cycle to a career that had never known defeat. Venkos asked me quietly if I thought the campaign would go smoothly. I told him of course it would. I told him these were soft creatures on a modest world with outdated weapons and no experience fighting anything that was not themselves. He nodded. He seemed reassured. He was gone before the first month on Keth was over. I do not blame myself for reassuring him. I blame myself for believing it. The journey to the Sol system took 11 days at standard transit speed. 11 days of briefings, weapons checks, strategy reviews and contingency planning. I knew my role. I had done this 42 times. The rhythm of preparation was comfortable to me, like a ritual that carried its own reassurance. On the 8th day, our forward scout vessels made contact with the human defense network around Keth. The colony had a small orbital station, a handful of patrol ships, and a planetary shield array that, according to our engineers, would not survive a focused barrage for more than 2 hours. I was on the bridge of my command vessel when the first engagement reports came in. Our fleet pushed through the outer defense line in 40 minutes. The human patrol ships fought hard. I will give them that even here at the beginning, but there were not enough of them, and our firepower advantage was too great. By the end of the day, we had orbital supremacy over Keth. High Command sent a broad transmission to the planet. Standard protocol. We announced our presence, our intentions, and the terms under which the colony could surrender peacefully. We gave them 72 hours to respond. From the surface, there was silence, no surrender request, no negotiation, no diplomatic contact at all. Vrail was not surprised. He told us some species needed to see us on the ground before they believed the fight was over. He said we would land, demonstrate our strength, and the resistance would collapse. I believed him. I had seen it happen before. We began our descent on the second day after taking orbit. My division went in first 40,000 soldiers, armored, equipped, and prepared for whatever a colony of roughly 200,000 humans could offer. I stood at the loading ramp of my transport ship as we broke through the cloud cover of Keth, watching the ground come up to meet us through the viewport. The land below was green and wide. Human structures dotted it, modest towns, road networks, farming installations that produced food for the colony. Everything looked exactly as small and manageable as our analysts had told us it would be. A junior officer standing next to me made a joke about how quickly this would be over. I did not respond. I was watching the ground. There were no people visible anywhere, no vehicles on the roads, no activity at all in the areas where our sensors told us the largest population centers sat. The colony had gone quiet. Even then, with every instinct my 42 campaigns had given me whispering that quiet was not the same thing as submission, I told myself it was fear. I told myself they were hiding in their homes, waiting for it to be over. I was about to find out, in the worst possible way, that hiding was not something humans did. We landed in 3 columns, spreading across the main inhabited region of Keth in a standard advance formation. The first column was mine. We moved through the outskirts of a human settlement called Redbridge, a mid-sized town of perhaps 30,000 people. The streets were empty. Doors were closed. The whole place was as silent as a painting. My lead scouts moved in first, checking structures, clearing blocks. They reported back. No weapons caches found, no organized resistance, no hostile contacts, just empty buildings, abandoned meals on tables, children's toys left in open yards. The quiet should have told me something. In every campaign I had ever run, when a population went silent, it was because they were preparing. Not hiding. Preparing. We had been on the ground for approximately 4 hours when the power station at the center of Redbridge went dark. At first, our instruments read it as a malfunction. Then the readings clarified. The power station had not broken down. It had been deliberately shut down from the inside and then destroyed. Someone had walked into the control room of the facility that provided heat, light and energy to 30,000 people and brought it down, not to use against us. We were still 2 kilometers from the station when it happened. Someone had destroyed the power station specifically so that we could not use it. They had denied us a resource they knew we needed. I stood in the street and stared at the column of smoke rising from where the station had been. My second-in-command, a veteran officer named Dureth, came to stand beside me. He said, "They are not going to make this easy," I said. "They are not." That was the last moment of anything I could call calm on the surface of Keth. Within the hour, our second column reported contact. Not a military unit, a group of roughly 40 humans, civilians by their clothing, armed with devices that should not have been able to damage our frontline armor. Should not have been. But the humans had done something clever with low-grade industrial compounds and standard tools, and the result was something that punched through our soldiers' shielding at close range. By the time my second column reached the position, they had lost 9 soldiers. The 40 humans were gone. They had moved into the surrounding hills before we could respond in force. I ordered a pursuit. The human group was caught within an hour by our airborne units. There were only 22 of them by then. When my soldiers closed the net, those 22 humans did not attempt to surrender. They did not ask for mercy. They spread out, took cover in every available position, and made our airborne units pay for every meter of ground. We lost 4 more soldiers, capturing 22 civilians who had never, as far as our intelligence could tell, served a single day in any formal military unit. I looked at the prisoners when they were brought to me, men and women, some of them older than I had expected, some of them very young. They were bleeding. They were breathing hard. Several of them were badly hurt. Not a single one of them looked afraid. One of them, a young male, perhaps 20 years old by human reckoning, with short red hair and a face still bleeding from a cut above his eye, looked at me the way I looked at problems I was about to solve. Calculating. Patient, as if he were the one studying me. I had the translator relay my standard demand: identify your commander, state the location of your main defense force, and your lives will be preserved. The young man said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, in a voice that was completely steady, "You have not seen the main defense force yet." I was going to ask him what he meant. Before I could, a tore through the rear of my command column 2 kilometers back. My communications officer reported a hit on our forward supply depot. The 22 prisoners had not been the force. They had been the distraction. I learned later that the name of the young man with the red hair was Owen Hale. He was a farmer. He had never held a weapon before the day we landed. We held Owen Hale and his group for 4 days. They gave us nothing useful. Not names, not locations, not the shape of any organized resistance. Owen Hale spent most of that time teaching some of the others a card game to pass the time. On the 4th night, they were gone. All 22 of them. Our security systems had not been compromised in any way we could identify. They had simply found a way out that we had not thought to close. When we searched, we discovered they had spent 2 days of their captivity quietly mapping our patrol routes. I reported the escape to Vrail. I told him these were not ordinary civilians. He told me all populations behaved strangely when their homes were occupied. He told me to focus on the military targets. The problem was that we could not find the military targets. Keth had a garrison of approximately 800 trained soldiers before we landed. We had expected to neutralize them in the first 48 hours. 3 weeks after our landing, we had confirmed fewer than 60. The rest had simply disappeared into the land like they had never existed. What we found instead, every day, was something harder to fight. Ordinary people. A woman named Laura Finn, a schoolteacher according to our records, organized the distribution of food and water to civilians living in areas we controlled. Every 3rd day, the supply routes she used also carried information about our troop positions to wherever the resistance was coordinating from. We monitored her for 2 weeks and could not identify how she was passing the intelligence. She was not using any communication technology we could detect. She was doing it with a network of children. Children who played near our positions and counted our vehicles out loud in a game they pretended to invent. Laura Finn had turned the entire civilian population of her district into a living intelligence system, and it cost us nothing we could act against, without becoming exactly the kind of force that would drive every human on the planet to pick up a weapon. When we eventually identified what she was doing and went to her home, the house was empty. She had been gone for 6 hours. The neighbors told us they had not seen her leave. The neighbors were lying, of course. Every single one of them was lying. And every single one of them knew that we knew, and not one of them changed their story. I had spent my career fighting armies. An army, you could see. An army had a command structure, supply lines, weak points. An army was something you could break. What the humans of Keth were doing was not an army. It was something older and harder. A resistance that lived in every house, every face, Every pair of eyes that watched us move through the streets. They had turned the entire colony into a single living thing that was quietly, methodically, and without visible panic, trying to make our presence unsustainable. And they were succeeding. In the first month, we lost 230 soldiers. Not in large engagements, not in battles where we could point to an enemy and respond with full force. We lost them in ones and twos and threes, to devices buried in roads we had already checked, to shots from buildings we had already cleared, to traps set in positions we had already occupied and declared safe. Each loss was small. In terms of raw numbers, we were absorbing the casualties without immediate strategic damage. But I had been a soldier for 40 cycles. I knew what those losses were doing to the people experiencing them. When you cannot see the opponent, when every cleared building might not have been truly cleared, when the road you walked yesterday might be different today, that kind of fighting does not just reduce your numbers. It eats at something else, something harder to replace. It eats at your certainty. My soldiers began to move differently, slower, more careful, eyes on every window, every shadow, every civilian who walked too close or stood too still. The jokes stopped, the card game stopped, the easy, professional confidence of a force that had never lost started to crack at the edges. I remember the night a soldier named Trell Can came to my tent, a 6-cycle veteran decorated twice, someone I had personally promoted. He sat down across from me and told me, very quietly, that his unit was afraid, not of being hurt. Soldiers in my experience were rarely truly afraid of that. They were afraid of the thing that was happening here. The invisibility of the threat. The fact that the enemy was not somewhere you could point to and plan against. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere, and it was patient in a way we were not built to endure. I told Trell Can to hold his unit together. I told him things would improve when we found the resistance supply lines and cut them. I told him the resistance could not sustain this level of activity without a center, and when we found the center, it would collapse. He looked at me with an expression I had never seen on a soldier's face before. Not fear, exactly. Something closer to the face of someone who had begun to suspect that the rules he had learned no longer applied. He said, "Commander, I do not think they have a center." He was right. That was the thing I had not yet fully understood. The humans of Keth were not fighting from a center. There was no headquarters to find, no commander to remove, that would make the rest stop. The resistance was flat and distributed, and it reorganized around every gap we created in it. The way water fills a shape. The night after my conversation with Trell Can, one of my patrols found a human soldier in the ruins of a transport we had disabled 3 days before. He had been there the whole 3 days, surviving on minimal water, watching our patrol patterns and recording them by hand in a small notebook. His name, we learned later, was Pete Arden. He was a corporal in the Keth Colonial Garrison. He had been wounded twice during the initial contact and had crawled, in the dark, into the wreckage of our own vehicle and stayed there for 72 hours to gather intelligence. He was still gathering intelligence when we found him. He asked my soldiers if they could hold his notebook steady, so he could finish writing his current notes. I asked him through the translator why he was still doing that. He was surrounded. The notebook would never reach anyone, he said. You do not know that. He said it without anger, without drama. A simple statement of fact. I ordered him given medical care. Not out of mercy, not at that moment, but because I wanted to understand what was inside a mind that could spend 3 days in the wreck of an enemy vehicle, wounded, and spend those 3 days taking notes. I do not think I ever fully understood the answer. What I did understand by the end of the first month was that our timetable had collapsed completely. The 30-day campaign that Vrail had projected had passed, and we were not close to pacification. We were not close to anything that resembled control. I requested a meeting with Vrail and gave him my honest assessment. I told him that the standard approach was not working. The humans were not fighting the way any species we had faced before had fought. They were not meeting us in the field. They were not trying to hold territory or protect command structures. They were making the cost of our presence higher and higher, day by day, until the calculation of the campaign shifted. Vrail listened. He agreed that adjustments were needed. The adjustments we made were tactical: more air coverage, wider patrol networks, faster response to contact reports. We also made a strategic change that I now believe was our first true mistake. We tightened our control on the civilian population. We restricted movement. We required identification at checkpoints. We monitored communications more aggressively. The humans of Keth answered every one of these measures by routing around them within days. When we restricted movement, they moved at night through paths we had not charted. When we required identification at checkpoints, accurate false documentation appeared within a week. When we monitored communications, they stopped using communication technology entirely and returned to methods so old that our monitoring systems were not designed to detect them. Notes. signals, patterns in ordinary behavior that meant nothing to us and everything to them. And all the while, the losses continued. Not catastrophic, not dramatic, just steady, quiet, and relentless. The name for what the humans were doing, I learned from captured documents, was guerrilla warfare. It was not a new concept for them. They had been doing it to each other for thousands of years, whenever a weaker group faced a stronger one and refused to simply lose. They had a long memory for this kind of fighting. They had been practicing it, in one form or another, since before my civilization had reached the stars. I should have known that. It was in the intelligence files. I had read about their long history of brutal internal conflict, and I had categorized it as evidence of a primitive, self-destructive species. I had not understood that what all those centuries of fighting each other had built was something remarkable. A population that, on a deep level, already knew how to survive an occupation. They did not need to be taught. They remembered, and they were not going to stop. By the end of the second month on Keth, 3 things had happened that I could not ignore. The first was that our casualty rate had moved in the wrong direction. We were spending 6 soldiers for every confirmed resistance member we removed. The resistance was not shrinking in proportion to its losses. Every person we removed from the field seemed to be replaced almost immediately by someone new, someone who had not been involved before but had now decided to start. The second was that the resistance had begun targeting infrastructure rather than our soldiers. Power relays, communication towers, supply storage. They were not trying to defeat us in the field. They were trying to make the colony impossible to hold. The third was the broadcasts. Someone among the human resistance had acquired a transmitter capable of reaching our command frequencies. They began broadcasting in Vorn. Not perfectly, the translation was rough but clearly enough to understand. The first broadcast was a list of names. The names of every Vorn soldier we had lost since landing, said slowly, clearly, one by one, all 230 of them. The second broadcast was a message. It said, "We know who you are, we know what you want, we will not give it to you, come home." The third broadcast was music, human music, something slow and quiet, transmitted on our emergency channel in the middle of the night. I listened to it alone in my command tent. I did not understand the words. I did not need to. Whatever that music was saying, it was saying it to someone who was far from home and tired and no longer sure of the ground beneath them. By that point, that description fit every soldier in my division. I sent Vrail a full tactical assessment and recommended a significant shift in strategy. I told him the standard pacification approach was going to fail here, and that we needed to rethink the entire campaign. Vrail read my assessment and told me to hold the line. Reinforcements were coming. With more forces on the ground, he said, we would achieve the coverage we needed to shut down the resistance for good. I sent back a single reply. I told him the reinforcements should be very well rested, and they should read human history before they landed. I do not think they did. The reinforcements arrived 60 days later. 12,000 soldiers, fresh equipment, new officers carrying the same confidence I had brought to this planet 2 months earlier. Vrail arrived with them personally. He walked through our positions, reviewed the reports, listened to my briefings, and then he told me I was being cautious. He said it with respect for my record. He said the reports showed a manageable resistance operation that simply needed more aggressive response. We had been too reactive. It was time to go on the offensive. I was cautious because caution was the only thing keeping my division functional. But Vrail was my superior. So we went on the offensive. For 3 weeks we pushed hard, increased action on suspected resistance positions, more aggressive checkpoint operations, wider search missions through civilian districts. Vrail wanted to find the resistance infrastructure and cut it out. What happened instead was this. The resistance grew, not because we were wrong to push, because the pushing itself was the recruitment tool. Every family that watched their homes searched, every elder asked to show papers at a checkpoint, every young person who saw a Vorn soldier point a weapon at someone they loved, every one of them became a potential node in a network that did not need formal organization to function. The numbers told the story plainly. In the 3 weeks of the offensive, we confirmed the removal of approximately 200 resistance members. In the same 3 weeks, our surveillance showed roughly 600 new civilians had moved into active support of the resistance. We were fueling the fire we were trying to put out. And then the technology started changing. In the second month of the offensive, my engineers brought me a device recovered from a destroyed resistance position. It was unmistakably a Vorn energy conduit, the component that regulates discharge intensity in our weapon systems. The specific design was from our current generation of field equipment, not anything that had been in use long enough to reach human markets. Someone had taken one of our disabled vehicles, removed the weapons system, and rebuilt the conduit from scratch. The device my engineers were holding was not identical to ours. It was better in one specific way. It had been adapted to interface with human weapon platforms without requiring modification of the human system. They had solved, in weeks, an integration problem that our own engineers told me would normally take months. I asked my chief engineer how this was possible. He looked uncomfortable. He said, "They look at how something works, and they change it until it works better for them. They do not start from theory. They start from the object in front of them." I asked, "How many of these could they have built?" He said, "As many as they can find raw materials for. And they can find raw materials in every disabled vehicle we have left on this planet." I had left a great many disabled vehicles on that planet. The next contact with a resistance unit confirmed what my engineer had told me. The humans were using weapons that were, in several specific ways, superior to their original versions. They had taken our technology, stripped it, rebuilt it, and made it suit them better. They had done it under occupation, with no manufacturing base, in conditions that should have made any technical work nearly impossible. If they could do that with weapons technology, what else were they doing that we had not noticed? The answer came in layers over the following weeks. Our communication encryption was compromised. Not broken directly, the humans lacked the computational power for that. What a young communications technician named Ethan Ward had done was something more careful. He had been monitoring our transmissions for 2 months, not trying to decode them but mapping the patterns, the frequency of transmissions, the timing, the duration. He had built by hand a map of what our communications architecture looked like in practice, and from that map he had deduced enough about our command structure to route around it. He knew where the gaps in our coordination were. He knew which units communicated with which, and how long it took for an order to travel from my command to a field position. He used that knowledge to time the resistance actions for the precise windows when our response capability was lowest. We found his observation post by accident. A patrol came across a concealed position in a hill that overlooked 3 of our major transit routes. The post was empty by the time they reached it. On the ground, left behind in apparent haste, was a single handwritten notebook. My translator read it to me. It was not tactical notes in any traditional sense. It was observations, descriptions, the time a supply convoy had passed, how many vehicles, which routes they varied between, the patrol rhythms of 6 different units over 43 days of observation, weather patterns and how they correlated with changes in our air coverage, personal observations about individual soldiers, their habits, their routines, the things that made them predictable. Ethan Ward had been watching us the way a scientist watches an experiment, patient, careful, comprehensive. And somewhere out there in the colony, what he had written in other notebooks was being used to make the resistance more effective. Every week, I never caught Ethan Ward. 3 weeks after we found his observation post, I started hearing his name on the resistance broadcasts. Not his real name, a description that my translator rendered as the listener, but I knew who it was. And knowing that one person, one young man with a notebook and patience, had fundamentally damaged our operational security, left me deeply uncomfortable in a way that stayed with me. He was not exceptional among his people. That was what I finally understood. He was not a specially trained intelligence operative. He was a communications technician who had been given a problem and had sat down and thought about it very carefully for a very long time. There were thousands of humans on Keth. How many of them were doing the same thing in their own specific area? How many of them were sitting somewhere quiet, watching, listening, taking notes, finding the gap that their particular knowledge gave them access to? The answer was all of them. In one way or another, all the time. I brought this assessment to Vrail in a meeting that did not go well. I told him we were not facing a resistance movement in the conventional sense. We were facing an entire population that had decided, without any formal organization, to treat our presence as a problem to solve. And they were solving it the way they solved every other problem, through observation, adaptation, and a refusal to stop working at something until it yielded. Vrail asked, "Is there any version of the standard approach that works?" I told him, "No." He asked, "What do you recommend?" I said, "I recommend we consider what our actual goal is and whether this colony is worth what achieving it is going to cost." He was quiet for a long time. Then he told me that High Command would not hear of withdrawal. This campaign had been presented to the Ascendancy as a demonstration of reach and power. Pulling back from a colony of 200,000 humans, on a planet with limited strategic value beyond the principle of the thing, would be a statement we could not afford to make. I understood his position. I did not agree with it. The broadcasts had changed by this point. The early ones had been focused and tactical. They were still doing that. But they had also begun documenting names, dates, incidents. Every action our forces took in the civilian districts was being recorded and transmitted outward, on a frequency that could reach the inner colony systems, where human ships still operated freely. They were building a record and sending it to anyone who might be listening. The purpose was not immediate. We were not going to lose this war because other humans heard a broadcast. But the message was clear, and I heard it even if Vrail chose not to. You are being watched, and we are making sure the record does not end with us. There was a woman named Diane Cross in the broadcasts. We never confirmed her identity visually, never located her. But her voice became a constant presence on our command frequencies, calm and precise, speaking in Vorn that improved steadily with every transmission until, by the 4th month, she sounded nearly fluent. She never threatened. She simply described what was happening, in accurate detail, with dates and unit designations that told us she had access to intelligence that should have been impossible to obtain. And once a week she said the same thing at the end of every broadcast. She said, "We are still here." I heard it as a statement. My soldiers heard it as something else. I could see it in their faces. 3 words, said in their language on their frequencies, had begun to carry a weight that simple words should not have. We are still here. After 6 months on Keth, after all the force we had brought, all the technology we had deployed, all the losses we had absorbed and inflicted, they were still here. The night I accepted that we were not going to break their will on this planet, I lay in my command tent and stared at the ceiling and thought about the probe the humans had sent into the stars, carrying music and a map to their home. I finally understood what that probe had really been. Not innocence, not naivety. It had been confidence. The specific, calm confidence of a species that had survived everything their own world had thrown at them, and every catastrophe they had thrown at each other, and had come out the other side still reaching outward. They had sent a greeting to the unknown, because they were not afraid of the unknown. They were curious about it, and now the unknown had come to them, and they were treating it the way they treated everything, as a problem they were going to solve. The 8th month brought something new. Up until that point, our casualties had been steady but manageable. 200, then 300, then 500 over the full period. Each loss was real, each one left a gap, but the Ascendancy's war machine was large enough to fill the gaps. We kept going. Then the Resistance found our supply ships. Not our ground supply lines, those they had been disrupting since the beginning. The orbital supply routes. Our resupply vessels made regular runs between the fleet and the ground forces, dropping materiel at 3 designated landing zones. The Resistance had been watching those routes since the beginning. We had adjusted the schedules, changed the landing zones, varied the frequencies. It did not matter. 3 supply ships were struck in a single week. The weapons used against them were assembled from the same adapted technology my engineers had been finding in Resistance caches for months. But by now those improvised weapons had been through enough iterations that they were functional, tested, and effective. We lost 40% of 1 week's supply delivery to 3 coordinated strikes on our orbital routes. 40%. Vrail called an emergency council. Every senior officer in the Keth campaign was present. The mood in that room was something I had not encountered in 40 cycles of service. Not panic. Something quieter and more dangerous. The specific discomfort of intelligent people who had begun to suspect they had fundamentally misunderstood the problem. I presented my assessment again. I said we were not fighting a resistance movement. We were fighting the inherent capacity of the human population, and that capacity was not going to run out, be exhausted, or yield because we applied more pressure. More pressure was producing more capacity. A general named Vrethsas, who I had known for 20 cycles, said something that stopped the room. He said, "They are getting better while we are getting worse." Everyone knew it was true. The Resistance was measurably more effective at month 8 than it had been at month 1. Better intelligence, better methods, better coordination, and a higher proportion of the population actively involved. They had adapted to everything we had done and were continuing to adapt faster than we could change our approach. We, on the other hand, had absorbed enough losses and enough sustained pressure that our soldiers were performing below the standard I would have expected when fresh. Response times were slower, unit cohesion was lower. Decisions in the field were more cautious, sometimes too cautious, which meant opportunities missed. They were improving, we were degrading. Vrethsas was the first to say out loud what I had been thinking for 2 months. He said, "This colony is not going to be pacified. The only question is what we do next." Vrail looked at him, he looked at me, he looked at the faces around the table. He told us he needed 3 more days before he would make any recommendation to High Command. 3 days later, before Vrail had sent his message, the Resistance struck our primary communications relay on the surface. It went down for 6 hours. In those 6 hours, 14 separate operations were conducted against our positions across the entire zone of control. The operations were coordinated. Precisely, carefully coordinated. They struck supply points, a weapons cache, 2 command positions, and 6 patrol units simultaneously. In 6 hours, with our communications down. I stood in the aftermath and thought, they have been planning this for weeks. They let us have the relay until they needed it gone. They let us rely on it, and then they took it when it mattered most. That was the night I truly stopped sleeping, not because of fear of attack, because I had spent 42 campaigns building a model of how conflict worked in my mind, and in one night, in one coordinated action by people who had no business being this capable against a force like ours, that model had stopped being true. I lay in the dark and thought, we have been on this planet for 8 months. In 8 months, these people have gone from a small colony with a handful of trained soldiers to a distributed, adaptive, continuously improving operation that has compromised our supply lines, degraded our operational security, and is getting better every week. And we have not broken them. We have not come close. What does a species look like at full strength? I did not sleep. I lay there and I thought about what came next, and the more I thought, the colder I felt. High Command's response to Vrail's situation report was not a recommendation to withdraw. It was a directive to escalate. The message came through on the 12th day of the 9th month. I read it standing at my command station, and I felt something I had not expected to feel. Not anger, not despair, something closer to a specific cold clarity. The feeling of knowing what is about to happen before it happens, and being unable to stop it. High Command had authorized a comprehensive suppression operation. 200 additional ships would arrive within 3 weeks. Another 30,000 ground forces. Orbital bombardment capability that we had not used yet. The objective was to destroy the resistance infrastructure completely and decisively, in one operation, and end the campaign before the cost grew any larger. Vrail summoned me immediately after the orders arrived. He was not the same man who had come to Keth 9 months earlier. The Vrail who had told me I was being cautious, who had walked through our positions and seen manageable problems. That Vrail had been replaced by someone who had watched 8 months of the impossible. He was still precise, still disciplined, but his eyes carried something that had not been there before. I said, "This is a mistake." He said, "I agree." I said, "Then tell them." He said, "I already did, 3 times. Read the order, Varath. This is not a recommendation we can refuse." I read the order again. Every word of it carried the absolute confidence of people who had not spent a single day on this planet, who had read the reports without feeling what the reports described, and who believed that more force was always the answer to insufficient force. I thought of Ethan Ward somewhere in the hills, still watching. I thought of Diane Cross, still broadcasting. I thought of Owen Hale, who had looked at me from his position as a prisoner, with the calm eyes of someone who was simply waiting. I said, "They are going to let us come. They are going to let the full force land, and they are going to lead us somewhere." Vrail said, "Yes, I believe so too," I said. "And we are going to follow because we have been given no other option." He said nothing. He handed me the operational order. The reinforcements arrived on schedule. 200 fresh ships, 30,000 troops, orbital capability that could alter the surface of a world if ordered. On the morning of the operation, I stood on the bridge of the command vessel and watched the scale of what we had assembled. It was by any measure an overwhelming force, larger than anything we had brought to any of the 6 previous campaigns, larger, in terms of pure material, than the resistance on Keth had any rational answer for. I have thought about that morning many times since. The specific irony of standing there, looking at that force and knowing, in the place where honest soldiers keep their honest thoughts, that it was not going to be enough. Because strength was not the variable that mattered here. The humans had known that from the beginning. They had never been trying to match our strength. They had been doing something else entirely. We pushed in 3 columns, precisely as we had in every major operation before. The northern column advanced along the main transit corridor into the highland settlement zones. The central column moved toward the largest population center. The southern column swept through the valley networks where our intelligence suggested abyss. The largest resistance supply caches were located. For 4 hours everything went exactly as planned. We made ground. We met light resistance at 3 checkpoints. Nothing our forces could not handle. The aerial units reported the corridors ahead as clear. Communications were clean. Every unit was exactly where it was supposed to be. I was in the command center, watching the advance maps, when my eastern flank unit reported something strange. A string of abandoned positions, not abandoned in haste, but cleared methodically, completely. No material left behind, no intelligence to collect, just empty ground that had until recently been actively used. I had seen that before. In the first week on Keth, before the first major ambush, the area we were advancing into had gone very quiet. I sent a priority alert to all column commanders. I told them to slow the advance. I told them to run full sensor sweeps before proceeding. The message reached the northern column in time. It slowed. It did not reach the central column in time. The central column was 3 kilometers into the main approach when the road beneath 2 of its lead vehicles changed. Not an impact, not initially. Something more controlled. The road surface, which our engineering analysis had certified as solid 48 hours earlier, had been excavated and replaced. The lead vehicles fell into channels that had been dug precisely to match their wheel spacing. The column stopped. It bunched together, which was exactly what the resistance had been waiting for. What happened in the next 20 minutes I can describe technically. Weapons from covered positions on both sides of the approach. Aerial units engaged by ground systems assembled from components salvaged over 9 months of careful work. The column's ability to maneuver was limited by the road structure itself, which had been modified to channel them forward into progressively more dangerous ground. The central column lost 600 soldiers in 20 minutes. In the same 20 minutes, the southern column discovered that its intelligence had been fabricated. The supply caches they were advancing toward did not exist. They had been constructed specifically for our surveillance to find false structures, false indicators, false heat signatures generated by equipment built specifically to defeat our sensors. The southern column was out of position when the resistance struck the true supply lines running across the center of the operation, and the northern column, which had slowed on my warning, found itself facing a different problem. Its slowdown had caused it to fall out of coordination with the orbital support schedule. The coverage it was supposed to have at the critical moment was not there. 3 columns, 3 separate traps, each one designed to account for a different operational pattern, including the pattern of a cautious commander who might try to slow things down. They had accounted for me. At some point in those 20 minutes, I stopped issuing orders and started simply watching the advance maps, because the orders I was issuing were solving problems that had already been solved for us in ways I had not planned for. I moved my personal command unit to a forward position to re-establish contact with the central column. That was my decision. I made it because I needed to see the situation directly, not through sensor feeds. I should have stayed in the command center. The strike on my position was precise. A kinetic impact from a ground-based system that hit the side of my command vehicle with enough force to flip it. I remember the impact. I remember the vehicle going over. I do not remember the next several minutes. When I was conscious again, I was on the ground 30 meters from the vehicle. 3 of my limbs were gone. The pain was significant, but pain in situations like that becomes background information. Present and noted, but not the thing the mind focuses on. What my mind focused on was a face, very human face. Young male. He had gray eyes and a long cut across his forehead that was bleeding freely. He was wearing a resistance jacket, one of the rough, improvised uniforms the resistance had adopted over the months of the campaign. He was pulling me away from the vehicle, which was on fire. I asked him, in a voice that came out quieter than I expected, why he was doing that. He said, in Vorn that was clearly not natural to him but good enough, because you are alive. We do not leave living things to burn. He pulled me another 10 meters from the vehicle, and then worked on the wounds in my limbs. Not full medical treatment but compression, slowing the blood loss. He worked quickly, the way someone works who has done this before. I asked him his name. He told me his name was Cole Marsh. I asked if he was going to hand me over to the resistance command. He said, there is no resistance command. There is just us. I said, why are you helping me? He thought about it for a moment. Then he said, because this is over. You know it is over. Go home. Tell them what happened here. He looked at me with those gray eyes, and there was nothing in them that I could read as hatred. There was something else, something I have spent a long time trying to name correctly. It was pity, not contempt. Pity. The pity of someone who has watched another person walk into a situation that should have been avoidable and could not stop them. He stood up, checked the area, and walked away into the rubble without looking back. Grace Nolan, a human medic who arrived 20 minutes later with a small resistance medical unit, completed the treatment Cole Marsh had started. She was precise and efficient, and she did not speak to me the whole time, except to tell me what she was about to do before she did it. When she was done, she helped me to a position where my remaining forces could find me, and pointed in the direction of the nearest Vorn unit. Then she left. I sat in the rubble of my command vehicle and listened to the sound of the battle winding down around me. The resistance was not pursuing the retreat of my columns. They had done what they needed to do. They were pulling back, disappearing into the land the way they always did. Our 3 columns had been reduced to fractions of their original strength in under 3 hours. Vrail ordered a full retreat to the landing zones. In the confusion of the retreat, 2 of the 3 designated landing zones had been modified in our absence, not destroyed, not occupied, simply made unusable through changes that our engineers said would take days to reverse. We crowded into the 3rd zone, 12,000 soldiers in a space designed for 4,000. Vrail stood next to me in the landing zone, looking out at the hills where the resistance had gone. He was quiet for a long time, then he said, they let us build the operation. They watched us prepare for 2 weeks and they let us come because they knew what we would do with more force. We are predictable, I said. Yes, he said. We always were. From somewhere in the hills, carried on the wind and faint enough that I could not be certain I was hearing it correctly, I heard the beginning of a broadcast, Diane Cross's voice, reading another list, not our names this time, the names of the human dead, all of them, from the first day of the campaign to the last. She read them slowly. She read every single one. In the silence of the landing zone, with 12,000 of my soldiers standing around me, I heard every name clearly. It took a very long time. I counted them, in my head, as she read them. I had spent 9 months calculating resistance capacity in terms of force ratios and supply limitations. I had reduced the humans of Keth to variables in a tactical calculation. Diane Cross would not let me do that in the landing zone. Each name was a specific weight, not a variable, a person who had made a choice and not come back from it. When the list ended, there was silence. Then she said the thing she always said. We are still here. Vrail ordered the evacuation to begin the next morning. We were leaving Keth. We were leaving it to the people who had never left it. Not in 9 months of occupation, not under any pressure we had brought. I boarded the transport ship in the first light of a Keth morning with my remaining limbs and a body that would need a long time to rebuild. I did not look back at the landing zone, at the hills, at the colony we had failed to take. Somewhere below, Cole Marsh was walking back through the rubble. Ethan Ward was probably already at a new position, already watching something. Laura Finn was probably already reorganizing supply networks for a population that had a great deal of rebuilding ahead of it. Diane Cross was already composing the next broadcast. They had not stopped to celebrate. I had not heard celebration in any of the communications we intercepted during the retreat. They had simply gone back to work. I thought, as the transport lifted, that this was the truest thing I had learned about them. They did not stop to celebrate. They had too much to do. There was always more to do. I returned home on a ship that carried fewer soldiers than it should have. The journey took 11 days, the same as the outbound trip, and I spent most of it in the medical wing with a body that had to relearn what shape it was. The medics were professional and thorough. They told me the regeneration process would take between 6 and 18 months. I thanked them. I lay in the medical bay and I reviewed, for the entire 11 days, everything that had happened on Keth. Not tactically. I had done the tactical review in real time, while the evacuation was happening around me. What I did on the journey home was something different. I thought about the humans themselves, not what they had done to us, but what they were. Because by the time we left Keth, I had seen enough to answer the question that had bothered me in the briefing room before the campaign began. I had wondered, looking at the record of that probe they had sent into space, what kind of creature looks at the unknown and sends it a gift? Now I knew. A creature that has already survived every catastrophe it could have imagined, and then some. A creature that carries, somewhere in its nature, the unshakable belief that survival is not the finish line. Not even winning is the finish line. The finish line is what comes after winning. When you get to build something, when you get to reach out again toward whatever is next. The probe was not innocence, it was intention. The intention of a species that knew, with a certainty earned by surviving everything that had tried to stop them, that they were going to be around long enough to need friends. I thought about Cole Marsh, pulling me away from a burning vehicle because he did not leave living things in fire. I thought about Grace Nolan, treating my wounds with precise hands and no cruelty. I thought about Pete Arden, wounded in the wreck of our vehicle, still taking notes with the calm of someone for whom giving up was not an option that existed. These were not unusual humans. I know that now. They were ordinary. They were what ordinary looked like in that species, under those conditions. That is the thing I could not have imagined before I went to Keth. Not the tactics, not the adaptability, not even the will. What I could not have imagined was the specific quality of human ordinariness, the way that an entire population of ordinary people, without anyone fundamentally exceptional, could produce a resistance that a 42 campaign veteran could not break. They did it because it was simply what they did. Facing a problem, they worked on it. Facing a stronger opponent, they worked harder. Facing a situation that by every measure should have been impossible, they treated it as a difficult version of the same thing they had always done. They refused to stop, not out of fanaticism, not out of ideology, not because some great leader had given them a reason. They refused to stop because stopping for them was genuinely not the first instinct. Not even the second. I presented my full report to the tribunal 6 months after our return. I presented it completely and without revision. I named my own failures, not as self-punishment. I have too much respect for my own record to perform false humility, but because the tribunal needed to understand that what happened on Keth was not the result of poor preparation or insufficient force. It was the result of a fundamental misunderstanding about what kind of species we were dealing with. The tribunal listened carefully. They asked many questions, most of them good ones. Some asked whether the result was specific to Keth, to this particular colony with its particular circumstances. Could a different target, a core human world, a less settled population, be approached differently? I told them no. I told them that the humans of Keth were not exceptional humans, they were typical ones. Everything they did, the distributed resistance, the rapid adaptation, the capacity to use every available resource in the service of a shared purpose, all of it was a natural expression of what they were as a species. A different colony would have done the same things with different specifics. A core world would have done them with greater resources and longer history. The question was not whether the result would be different. The question was how much worse it would be. One of the tribunal members, a senior council representative who had supported the campaign from the beginning, asked me if I was recommending a permanent policy of avoiding human space entirely. I said, I am recommending that before anyone in this room makes any decision regarding human beings, they take the time to actually understand what they are deciding about. Stop looking at the numbers, the population figures, the technology ratings, the resource assessments. Start thinking about the question that matters. Not what can they do. We found that out. The question is, what will they keep doing, regardless of what we do to make them stop? The answer to that question is everything. They will keep doing everything, indefinitely. They do not have an off switch for trying, for adapting, for refusing to accept the conclusion that is directly in front of them. They tried to send a greeting to the cosmos while they were still arguing with each other about borders on their own world. They built schools in a colony under occupation. They turned their children's games into intelligence networks, not because they were ruthless, but because they were resourceful in the way that long survival makes things resourceful. I want to be precise about something, because I think there is a version of this story where the humans become monsters in the telling, where the fear I carried off that planet becomes fear of something dark and terrible. That is not the right lesson. The humans of Keth were not monsters, they were people. Owen Hale was a farmer who learned to fight because he had no other option. Laura Finn was a schoolteacher who protected her community the only way available to her. Ethan Ward was a young man who was good with patterns and used what he was good at. Cole Marsh was someone who believed, in the middle of a conflict, that you did not leave living things in fire. These are not terrifying qualities in themselves, they are human ones, and the reason they were so effective against us is precisely because they were not exceptional. They were typical. They were what that species does when pushed. The most dangerous kind of opponent is not the most powerful one. It is the one that will not stop regardless of the cost, that improves with every iteration, and that carries in its ordinary members the capacity for extraordinary response. The most dangerous kind of opponent is one whose everyday qualities are themselves the greatest challenge. The humans are that opponent, and here is what makes them different from every other species I have encountered, including the ones we successfully overcame. They are not like that because they were designed that way. They did not engineer themselves for resilience. They did not plan for adaptability or build their social structures to maximize resistance under occupation. They simply lived for a very long time, in conditions that rewarded those qualities, kept what worked, and passed it to the next generation. They are what they are because their world made them that way. And their world made them that way because their world was difficult, and they stayed on it anyway, and they kept trying. I think about the probe again, the Voyager drifting through the dark between stars, carrying a greeting and a map. They put their address on it. They told the universe where to find them. A species that has survived everything the universe has already thrown at them, that keeps building things in the spaces between difficulties, that pulls strangers from burning vehicles and treats wounds with precise hands, and teaches card games in captivity to keep morale from breaking. That species put its address on a small machine and sent it into the unknown. Not because they were naive, because they were confident. I left that planet with 3 limbs, fewer than I arrived with. And I came home with something I did not expect to bring back. Not defeat exactly. Defeat is a clean thing, a final thing, a thing you can name and set aside. What I brought home was more complicated. I brought home respect. Real respect. The kind that changes the shape of how you think about things afterward. I had spent my career believing that what I had, the discipline, the technology, the institutional weight of the ascendancy, was the highest expression of what an advanced civilization produced. Keth showed me something else. It showed me that the highest expression of what a civilization produces is not its weapons or its ships or its command structures. It is the quality of its ordinary members. What does the average person do when everything is difficult, and the outcome is uncertain and there is no clear path forward? The average human, in those conditions, takes notes, teaches card games, builds tools from the wreckage of an enemy's equipment, pulls strangers from fire, keeps broadcasting, 300 years behind us in technology, and they were 300 years ahead of us in something I do not have a precise word for in Vorn. In human languages, I am told, it is sometimes called heart. To any council that reviews this testimony, to any commander who reads it while considering operations against human-held space, to any analyst who looks at the resource maps and the population figures and the technology ratings, and concludes that the calculation is favorable, I have one thing to say. You are reading the wrong numbers. The numbers that matter are not in the reports. They are in a small machine drifting through the dark between stars, carrying music. They are in a notebook left on a hillside, 43 days of careful observation, written in pencil. They are in a list of names, read slowly, everyone given its full weight. Do not start this. If you are thinking about starting this, think carefully. Not because you cannot cause them harm. You can. You can cause them a great deal of harm. But causing harm to something that responds by working harder, that heals by getting stronger, that turns every difficulty into a lesson is not a strategy. It is an education, and the education costs everything you bring to it. And if, despite everything I have said, you still believe that force and numbers and technology are enough, if you still look at the data and see a species you can manage, contain, and overcome, then let me leave you with the last thing I remember from the surface of Keth. The sun was rising. My transport was lifting. Below me, the colony was coming out into the morning. I could see them from the viewport, small figures in the early light, moving through the streets of a place they had refused to abandon. They were not celebrating. They were not standing still. They were already starting to clean up, already starting to rebuild, already moving forward to whatever came next, the way they always moved, without waiting to be told it was safe, without certainty that it would work, without any guarantee except the one they seemed to carry inside them like a second skeleton. The guarantee that they were going to keep trying. In 42 campaigns, I never met an opponent I truly respected. I met strong ones, clever ones, determined ones. I met species that fought hard and cost us real effort. Not one of them made me understand what I had been missing. The humans of Keth taught me what it looks like when a species refuses to accept the ending that is being written for them. They taught me that the most powerful thing in any conflict is not the largest weapon. It is the will to pick up the next one after the last one is gone. I am Vareth of the 8th Division. I have won 42 campaigns. I have lost one. I lost it to a farmer, a school teacher, a communications technician, a medic, and several thousand people just like them, who looked at everything we brought and decided that it was not enough to make them stop. They were right. This is my testimony.